All right, Ms. Goodere.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Graves.
Good
morning. We were discussing hypothetical scenarios on Friday, and we'd gone through 3 of them. The first one was the rendezvous point, and the second was observe, wait and feedback,
Yes.
perhaps at a nearby location. And the third was de-escalate. And I'd like to, you'll remember I said there were going to be 4 I was going to talk to you about, and I'd like to go over the 4th today.
Fine, yes.
And you'll remember that I was asking these questions in the context of a hypothetical reasonable officer.
Yes, correct.
Who complies with legal requirements and SOPs and these things. So I'd like to move on to scenario 4, if I may. So we are discussing scenarios where calls come in to the ACR and officers are deployed to an incident where the subject is alleged to have had a knife and perhaps have been chasing cars.
Yes.
And this hypothetical scenario is that this is a high-risk incident.
Yes.
The calls have been graded 1.
Yes.
So the 4th scenario, I'm calling verbal dominance, which actually was a phrase that you've used in your inquiry statement.
That's correct, yes.
And paragraph 73 for anyone that wants to look at that, but we don't need to go to that at the moment. So this, if I may describe it, is an authoritarian approach where the officer or officers are wanting to try and control the individual by a verbal dominance approach through of communication.
That's correct, yes.
And it's a methodology of trying to dominate the individual by getting them to comply with your instructions to minimise the risk or minimise the requirement to possibly use other force.
That's correct, yes. It's a sort of a verbal shock treatment, using very loud, very simple, direct verbal commands to try and verbally dominate the individual into submission.
And am I correct in saying that I've looked at other paperwork in this matter, and you've also described it as a hard stop?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So in terms of the officers arriving and considering that approach, if the officers use that approach, can you help us understand, in terms of permitting the officers time to observe and feed back to ACR, what impact does this approach, the verbal dominance approach, have on that?
Certainly on the feedback, as I said, hopefully the initial information that they'd located the individual would have been fed back immediately, which it wasn't. However, once they engage with the subject, it's unlikely that they're going to look to or possibly consider transmitting, because they're then engaged with the individual and all of their attention needs to be on that person to observe what they're doing and how they're responding to those verbal commands.
So this type of approach will delay or prevent, certainly immediately, that feedback being given to ACR.
The officer's attention would be on the subject, not on considerations of information to the ACR or to the other units attending.
Thank you. And in terms of permitting the officers time to attempt to engage or communicate with the subject, what impact would this tactical approach have?
It's a lot quicker, it's a lot faster approach. Once that decision is made, taking a hypothetical, if the armed response vehicle had turned up, I would have very much have expected a hard stop from them on Mr. Bayou in the street, out quickly, probably weapons drawn, strong verbal commands, instructing him to get his hands out where they could see him, possibly lie on the floor, kneel on the floor, etc.
But where there's no ARV there and it's officers who are unarmed, uniformed officers, would that minimise the ability of those officers to engage in this sort of tactical communications we were talking about on
Once that
Friday?
decision had been made to utilise that type of verbal communication, then yes, it sort of negates. It's difficult to come back down from that until such time as you have control of the individual and they've complied with the instructions or the commands that they've given them.
Thank you. And in terms of the ability of officers, if they are engaged in that verbal dominance approach, what impact would that have on their own personal ability to factor information into we discussed the national decision-making model and new information being factored in and reviewed and decisions being reviewed. What impact would that approach have on...
Obviously, at this point, their adrenaline, their heart rate are starting to raise because of the type of situation and the individual that they believe they're dealing with. What they'll be focusing on is the response from that individual against the commands that they're issuing. So every time a command is issued and a negative response or a resistance by lack of response comes from the subject, then they will be factoring that into that decision-making process. Basically, I'm telling them to do something, they're not doing it, therefore heightening the threat level, heightening their perception of risk.
Thank you. And to what extent would this approach permit officers, reasonable officers, to assess whether, to what extent the subject may be suffering from a mental health crisis or to be intoxicated by drink or drugs?
You've still got your observational skills, although they are starting to reduce because of the increased stress levels. You can still, visually see how the person is behaving. Some of the officers comment in their evidence in relation to what they thought or how they thought Mr. Bio was looking, for want of a better terminology. So that indicates to me that they were observing, they were taking that information in. So yes, you can probably still factor that in as to whether the person may be under the influence of drink or drugs or may be suffering some sort of mental ill health episode. But as I say again, their main focus, I would suggest at that point, is the fact that there's non-compliance because they've started down a road that they've really only got one way to go. They've got to make that individual at some point comply with what they're after them doing. So if verbal dominance isn't working, they have very little option other than to escalate from that point of view to make that individual comply with the directions that they're giving.
Are you able to help the chair understand, are there circumstances in which a reasonable officer would not adopt this type of scenario, the verbal dominance approach?
I think if the decision had been made to engage Mr. Bio in a more communicative way, possibly, as I said, trying to talk to him through the window, asking how he was, what's going on, what's he doing out on a Sunday morning, things like that. They might have gleaned more information in relation to his demeanour. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The officers decided on this verbal dominance approach. So I think it's difficult to sort of step back from that. If you think of it as a ladder, once you've decided to climb the ladder, it's quite difficult to then try and climb back down the ladder once you've came in at a certain level. It's a lot easier to come in at a lower level and then escalate from there, although not impossible, but it is difficult.
Talking about climbing that ladder, I wonder if we could look at some of the documents at that time and maybe also clear up something from Friday.
Yes.
Could we look at a letter of instruction that you were sent by Crown Office, and it's COPFS 00008.
Just the one, 24th of January? Yes.
You anticipated, yes. 24th of January 2018. And this is a letter of instruction from the Crown Office. You'll remember on Friday we talked about you being originally instructed by
Yes.
the Crown Office. And if we look through that, and if we go to the right down, I think to page 10, if I remember correctly, but there should be two documents in this doc ID, and there's a second letter of instruction at the very end. Here it is. So it's page 10, and that's dated the 22nd of February 2018.
That's correct, yes.
And so we'll deal with this first of all while we have it on the screen, and it shows that in fact a PowerPoint called PowerPoint Historic was provided to you by Crown Office under cover of this other letter.
From the second list of documents, yes.
Right. And if I'm right in my assessment, that will be a document COPFS 05973, which I think we looked at on Friday. It's a PowerPoint. And if we just wait a moment, that'll come up on the screen. And do you remember we looked at this on Friday?
That's correct,
briefly,
yes.
And was this the PowerPoint that you were sent by Crown Office?
Yes, having checked back over the weekend, that was the PowerPoint that was sent, yes.
Thank you. And then if we can go back, to COPFS 00008, and we'll go on to the second page of that document. So this is the letter of instruction to you from Crown Office. And do we see, in fact, that a number of training materials were sent to you with that letter of instruction?
Yes, that's correct. As I said, once I'd finished the case, obviously I deleted all of these files, but this was the original list. So yes, I was supplied that as part of my original instruction.
So although there may have been some confusion on Friday, that was your letter of instruction?
Yes, that was.
And you did receive training materials?
That's correct, yes.
And as part of those training materials, you did receive the use of force SOP.
Yes.
We see that at the number 1, Police Scotland Use of Force SOP version 1.03.
That's correct.
And you also, if we just move down that page slightly, you'll see at the very bottom there, well, no, right, it says Police Scotland Probationer Officer Safety Course Training Manual version 2, scanned in 2 separate sections, modules 1 to 3 and 4 to 9.
That's correct, yes.
And I think from memory on Friday you said that was the redacted document that you'd received.
From memory, yes, I said, because I haven't got the original document that was supplied. I remember it being particularly heavily redacted, but I was aware of the majority of the content anyway.
Thank you. And then we'll just briefly look at that manual. Again, PS 11538A, and I think we looked briefly at this on Friday. And I think that's the manual that we looked at, and you confirmed that was the one that you'd seen before.
That's correct, yes.
And then I'd like to move on to the use of force SOP, and this is PS 10933. And I'd like to ask you some questions about this standard operating procedure.
Yes.
In your experience, can you tell us what is a standard operating procedure?
It's a set of guidelines, sometimes referred to as a policy, in relation to how officers are expected to apply their powers to use force under the directions of Police Scotland.
Thank you. And you'll see that this is version number 1.03.
Yeah.
And that's the one that you were sent by the Crown.
Originally, yes.
Yes. And can we look at section 2, please, which is just, if we move down the page. Here. Thank you. And so we see 2 is called process or procedure, and 2 2.1, I'd like to go through these briefly with you and ask
Yes.
you some questions. The police service recognises that an individual's right to life and the maintenance of public order are paramount considerations when contemplating the use of force.
Correct, yes.
And 2.2 is any force used by a police officer or member of staff must be legal, proportionate and reasonable in the circumstances and the minimum amount necessary to accomplish the lawful objective concerned.
Correct, yes.
We've heard a reference to a mnemonic: plain, proportionate, legal, ethical, necessary, and
Accountable.
I've mixed up
Accountable,
my ethical,
necessary,
haven't
and
I?
ethical.
I can't spell today. But have you heard of that mnemonic?
Yes,
plain?
originally it was produced as plan, and then the E, the ethical, was added to it afterwards.
Right, thank you. Well, I'll stick with 2.2, which I can read out. So any force must be legal, proportionate and reasonable in the circumstances. I'm interested in any views you have about that phrase, legal, proportionate and reasonable. What does that mean?
They're all words drawn from sections of either legislation or powers for officers, police officers, to use force. Reasonable, necessary, in the circumstances. They all sit within legal definitions, both within England and Scotland, in relation to ethical and lawful use of force.
So it depends on the particular circumstances which exist at any given moment in time.
That's correct, and it doesn't just apply to police officers, it also applies to members of the public as well.
And then it says the minimum amount necessary to accomplish the lawful objective concerned.
Yes, that doesn't mean a minimum amount of force, it means a minimum amount to establish your objective. So if the minimum amount would be dictated as possibly lethal force, that means lethal force could be justified in those particular circumstances.
Again, is it dependent on the particular circumstances?
Very much so, yes. Every incident is different.
Right. Thank you. And then 2.3, action must be proportionate in relation to the competing rights of individuals, and any force used should be no more than is absolutely necessary.
Yes, terminology sometimes used there is you can't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut, to give that sort of analogy. It must be proportionate and in balance with the risk or the threat that you're trying to prevent.
So again, vital to know what the particular circumstances are.
Yes, the perception of the individual, whether incorrectly based or otherwise, is a major factor in this sort of anticipation.
And it says, in this regard, individual officers must be prepared to account for their decisions and to show that they were justified.
Yes, officers are sort of told that it's not just about telling or trying to explain why you did something. It's also a necessity for those officers to be able to explain why they didn't do something. So it's not just about the actions that they take, it's about the actions that they don't take. So you're looking at balancing that decision-making process with regards to what they've done against what they may not have done, especially that if they've considered that particular course of action and ruled it out, we would then need to know the reasoning behind that action being ruled out.
We've heard some evidence of a phrase or a word called preclusion. Are you able to explain that?
Exactly what I've just said. It's precluding an incident. If I give you again a hypothetical, if I decide as an officer to use my baton on an individual, the first question, or one of the first questions I expect to be asked is, why did you use your baton? So you answer that question by giving your justification as to why you used that particular tactical option. However, the second question I would then expect to be asked is, why did you not use your irritant spray? Why did you not use something else? Why did you not talk to them? Etc., etc. So looking at precluding those other tactical options and being able to give an explanation and a reason why that particular tactical option was ruled out. So it might be the case of, why didn't I use my irritant? I might say I was in an enclosed space, there were other officers present and I didn't want to use it, so I didn't cross-contaminate the other officers. There I'm giving an explanation as to a tactical option I've considered and precluded for a particular reason.
So it's not necessary to try every possible option?
No. Officers are given a toolbox, for want of a better terminology, and from that toolbox they draw what they believe to be the best tactical option to deal with the situation that they are faced with.
Thank you. And it's then goes on to say it is recognised as good practice for officers and staff to record details in their notebooks of all instances involving the use of force and the reasons why force was necessary.
Yes, it goes back to the accountability side of it. Without notes, without evidence, without an explanation as to why you've done something, it's very difficult to then explain that to a third party.
Thank you. And then 2.4, an arrest should be made as unobtrusively as possible. In no circumstances must a prisoner be harshly treated or have greater force used towards that person than is absolutely necessary to restrain them.
That's correct, yes.
Right.
Again, that just links back to the minimum force, or the minimum amount of force for the circumstances.
The minimum force necessary
In the circumstances.
In the circumstances and preclusion, which
Yes.
you've explained. Thank you. And then it says 2.5, the decision to use any defensive technique or equipment in a confrontational situation is for each individual to assess based on the circumstances involved.
And that goes back to the comment I made about the toolbox. It's the officer's decision as to what they decide to draw or use for that particular set of circumstances.
So the individual officers do have an element of discretion in assessing the appropriate level of response.
They do, because they are the one faced with the particular set of circumstances. Any interrogation or any investigation afterwards is being done by a third party who wasn't present at that time. So that's why the officer is in the best position to make that judgment call based on the training that they've been given.
And then at 2.6, do we see indiscriminate or unnecessary use of force is unacceptable and the individuals will be personally accountable for such improper use?
Yes, lays back, as I said, if it's their decision to do something, they are liable and they are responsible for that decision.
And there are only two criteria for any use of physical force, those being 1, justification, where the force used is reasonable and proportionate to the perceived threat.
That's correct.
And preclusion, where other reasonable response options have either been attempted and failed or are considered to be inappropriate.
Yes, which is what I've just explained.
It's what you've explained already. And then 2.7, the overriding principle is that any force used by police officers and staff must never be excessive. Any force used must be reasonable based on the individual person's perception of the threat that they are immediately facing.
That's correct, yes.
And so another important factor is the individual's perception of the threat.
Yes, and I said the officers, I said on Friday, the officers' perception is a major part of their assessment of the level of risk. Every officer will perceive a situation differently. If we look at the officers in this case, they were different sizes, different genders, had different views on the particular incident that they were being faced with. So they will have all come up with a slightly different initial level of risk and an initial assessment of that situation.
We've heard some evidence last week now that the use of force standard operating procedure and things that come from the manual that is taught, and in fact some of these key issues are in the PowerPoint. And was that your understanding of the position, that these documents mirrored each other?
Yes, as I said, obviously this document is far more in depth, as is the training manual. The PowerPoint is a very basic set of bullet points, and it really depends on how that is delivered as to how much information is given to the officers during the training. As I said, the lesson plan that supports that PowerPoint which should give a lot more information in relation to what key points should go from these documents and from the training documents to the officers.
We've heard some evidence about the use of force SOP that indicates that's given some priority or preeminence in relation to training. Is that your understanding of?
Yes, I mean all of the training packages contain a large element of use of force powers, and getting officers to fully understand their legal requirements under the law in relation to use of force and how that applies to their various tactical options.
Thank you. To go back for a moment to the 4 hypothetical scenarios that I gave you, I wonder if it's possible with your assistance to rank these in terms of force or the use of force, in the sense that you've explained to us justification, preclusion, and the climbing of the ladder that you talked about. So if we look at the 4 options, the 4 scenarios I gave, there was the rendezvous point, the observe, wait, feedback, de-escalation, and verbal dominance. I wonder if you could tell us, in terms of the ladder, climbing the ladder, can you explain to us where they would fall?
Basically, as you've given them, thinking about it logically, going to a rendezvous point, there's no interaction with the individual. So as a level of force, they haven't even got to presence yet, which is the first step on the ladder. Basically, an officer turns up in uniform. I'm here. I've come to sort this situation out. So they haven't even got to presence. It could be then born that if they're then parked in a marked vehicle some distance away from the individual, that could be classed as presence. They're visible. The individual can probably see them. Therefore, they're on the first step of the officer response. I would then go to the communication skills, which again is the next step on the officer response. So, although technically verbal dominance and the negotiation and sort of communication go together on the same level, I would suggest that it's an escalation to use verbal dominance skills, but you are technically still on the same level of officer response, which is communication skills. But I would suggest that the negotiation, the de-escalation would come first. If that didn't work, then an escalation to more verbal dominance or more crisis communication, for want of a better terminology, would be used by the officers. So, but you're still technically on the same level of communication skills.
But the verbal dominance is the authoritarian, I think was the word you used, approach. That would be the most forceful.
Technically, as per the training of the officers, it's not. It's on exactly the same level. It's just a different form of communication, and it's for them to decide what they think communication style is best suited to that individual and to that situation. So it's not an escalation, but if you think about in practice, whereby if I'm talking to somebody and trying to sort of negotiate and de-escalate and I'm not getting any response, I could then try that shouting verbal dominance routine, but I would technically, as per the officer's training and as per what we instruct officers from the manual, that would technically be on the same response level.
Thank you. If we continue with the use of force SOP, can we look at 4.6, please? And we've heard some evidence about profiled offender behaviour. And are you familiar with these levels? There's levels 1 to 5, I think, from compliance up to the serious aggravated assaultive behaviour. Sorry, maybe. So there's a level 5 is assaultive resistance. And is there, can you go up? And then 6 is serious aggravated assaultive resistance.
Yes.
And you're familiar with all of those?
Yes, these are terminologies that have been in existence for some time.
Right. And then if we can go on to 4.7, please. It says officer's reasonable response, force options. And this is the one with level 1, officer presence, which you've mentioned. Level 2, tactical communications. And tactical communications, I think, Is this what you're talking about in relation
Yes,
to?
and as I say, I think if you look at the bottom bit of that 4.7.3, it quite clearly says there, commands and/or instructions to an offender, even in a forceful vocal manner. So that would be your verbal dominance.
From what you said a moment ago, does tactical communication also include the lesser level of communicating in a conversational tone?
Yes, it's any communication, whether verbal or non-verbal, given by the officer or presented by the officer. So that could be how you stand, where you're standing, what you're saying, how you're saying it. It's the full rasp of communication skills that we talk about.
And we've heard that within each level, they're not neatly defined. There can be a range within each level that's given in this SOP.
That's correct. It's, as I said, it's a terminology and a system that's been used for a very long time. Over recent years, a lot of services have sort of drifted away from this and made it a lot more around a sort of a holistic approach in relation to assessing risk and looking at the different levels of resistance or the different levels of behaviour from subjects, and then getting officers to select elements from each of these that might better fit the situation that they're being faced with. This can be a little bit rigid, and it can be used as a continuum or a stepping ladder. Certainly, the way it is, it was taught then within Police Scotland.
And so, can we move back up to level 1 there, please? So this is the reasonable officer responses. Level 1 is officer presence, moving up to the serious aggravated. If circumstances permit and an officer wishes to use minimum force, where would he start?
It's not a matter of starting anywhere on the ladder. This is the situation. Is if the officer perceives that the level of resistance from the individual is at a certain level at the outset of the incident, then they are sort of trained to come in at that level, or what we class as the +1 version, where they're allowed to come in one level above that to be able to negate and actually deal with that level of resistance. So if we say, for example, in this situation, if we could possibly go down the document, back up the document, sorry. No,
up
the other
to
way,
the
please.
profile
Yeah, up to the
offender
profile
behaviour.
behaviour.
4.6.
So if we go right up to the beginning and we take this incident as an example.
So there's level 1 compliance.
Compliance,
there.
that's basically, I say, stand up, put your hands out, come here, sit down, don't move, and they comply. That's compliance, that's level 1. I'm getting what I want from the communication level that I'm using. If I don't get that, then I'm instantly being presented with level 2. So I'm getting a lack of response. The person's standing still. They're refusing to stop coming towards me. They won't show me their hands. Then I'm getting a resistance by gesture, by a lack of action, basically. Therefore, I may then escalate then to some form of control measure whereby I may adopt a different stance. I might use a different communication style, or I may even draw a piece of equipment to indicate to the individual that I don't want them to come any closer to me. So that could be an irritant spray, that could be my baton. I could adopt a defensive stance, which is obviously a lot sort of harsher than the body stance I may have been standing in previously.
So even the body language, the stance can be an escalation up the ladder.
We say an awful lot more from our body language in these types of situations than we do from our verbal communication. Therefore, how we look, how we stand, how we present ourselves to the subject can greatly change how that subject responds to us. That's why presence is the level 1, because sometimes just getting out of the vehicle or arriving at the scene in uniform with your equipment on can have an impact or a desired effect on the situation and those people involved in that situation.
We actually heard on Friday from a dog handler in Police Scotland who explained that sometimes even by opening the back of the door in the van and the dog's there in the cage, the very presence of the dog can have an impact.
Very much so. Very much so. Yes. You know, a dog even just even being getting out of the vehicle just turning up and the dog barking in the back of the vehicle can have an effect on individuals involved in a situation.
Right. Thank you. So moving on from the current situation, if I can ask you some more hypotheticals. So where officers are attending an incident, where the allegation is that the subject has a knife and has been chasing cars, there's been a call for all units to attend from the sergeant in charge of the team. And in a situation where the officers arrive at the scene, I'd like to ask you some questions about the tactical options that are open to them.
Yes.
To hypothetical, reasonable officers. So let's think first of all about the first officers arriving at any given scene in that scenario, where the subject is seen to be walking briskly and his eyes are bulging out of his head. It's been raining, blowing a gale, and the subject is wearing a t-shirt. His palms are held out. There's no knife visible in his hands. He's already walking towards the officers when those officers get out of the van, and an officer becomes aware at that point that the subject, was high on something. So thinking first of all about that scenario, could you tell us, if we could go and if we can look at what's on the screen, the profiled offender behaviour, what level of behaviour would a reasonable officer view that subject?
At that point, until such time as they actually engage with the individual, they haven't really got any level to start with, because they haven't issued any instructions. They've arrived, but the person is still walking towards them. So it's very difficult at that point to actually put the subject behaviour onto the level. As you say, at that point, I would be looking at the information in relation to what they knew before they arrived. As I said, specifically, they believe that the individual is in possession of a knife. But you're looking at the fact of, as I say, it's a cold morning. The person's just wearing a t-shirt. It's raining. Their demeanour, their look would indicate to the officer that there's possibly intoxication of some description. I would be looking at then thinking around how might this person respond to me. And you've got the two sides of the coin. It might be the case of, well, I get out the vehicle, or I approach, and they don't like police. They don't want to talk to us. They don't want to do anything, around what we're asking them to do. Or it may be the case of that I can try and talk to them. I'll try and see what's wrong with them. They're obviously, intoxicated or possibly intoxicated. I need to establish that. And that's sometimes only available by being able to talk to the individual, just to verify that fact.
So if we can move back on to 4.7, which is the reasonable officer's reasonable response, force options. And again, at that moment in time, before they've engaged with the subject, what would a reasonable officer response be?
Well, you've got the level one there. They're approaching the individual. They get out the vehicle. They then assess whether that individual and how that individual responds to their arrival. you know, they may run away, they may come and talk to you, they may ignore you. So you've got those three things to then weigh up as to the what are they doing and why are they doing it. Then you would go to level 2, so you would engage that individual, try to engage that individual in conversation. That may be something as simple as stand still, what's up, what you doing, hello, anything like that. And what sort of response then do I get? Do I get an ill response or some sort of physical or verbal response from that attempted communication? So you've got 1 and 2 very quickly together. You turn up and you try and engage the individual in conversation.
So at this point, is this about gaining more information to allow officers, reasonable officers, to then feed that into their national decision-making model?
Yes, from your observations, if you're believing that individual may be intoxicated, and taking into consideration, as I said, all those other factors about the weather, the dress of the individual, how they're acting, you're trying to sort of go over what you already know and trying to make sure that is the facts as they are, or is something else amiss, or something else afoot here. So you're actually trying to use questioning or communication to verify what you believe may be the situation that you're dealing with.
So in this scenario, would a reasonable officer be considering whether this was maybe a medical emergency or a medical matter?
Certainly in relation to drink or drugs at that point, then yes, again, you would have to take that medical consideration into account, yes.
We've heard some evidence from others about a condition known as ABD.
Yes.
You're familiar with that. We
Yes.
know from your inquiry statement. At this moment in time, given the scenario I've given you, would a reasonable officer be contemplating that as a possibility?
At that particular time, I believe not. There's insufficient, what we call the warning signs, are there yet. You have some in relation to the behaviour, but the behaviour in itself, although unusual, is not particularly bizarre. You start to build those, you would build that through that conversation and more observation of the individual, to consider whether that person may be having some sort of episode. At that point, are you dealing with somebody who is, as I said, is intoxicated rather than suffering from ABD? Or, if it's not intoxication, could it be a mental health episode? Could it be some sort of mental ill health?
And bearing in mind the possibility it might be a mental health episode or intoxication or some other condition, what would a reasonable officer do bearing that in mind?
I would be expecting them to try and verify that thought process. If that's their belief at that time, there's 2 things. One, they want to try and verify it through communication, through further observations. But at some point, once you make that decision that is the case, and it's not just somebody who is upset, possibly agitated, or possibly potentially violent, once that decision is made, then I would expect that you would go down the treating that individual as requiring medical assistance of some description.
How is it that officers would seek or obtain medical assistance for someone?
That could be one of 2 ways. They may call ambulance services to the scene if it was safe to do so. I would suggest in this situation at that point it possibly wasn't until such time as they knew that Mr. Bayo was under control and the knife had either been located or ruled out, or if they made the decision to approach and arrest Mr. Bayo or detain him, either by taking that individual to a suitable medical facility, a hospital, etc., or taking them to the police station, whereby medical assistance could be called to the police station. That again would be that judgment call dependent on the level and the type of medical assistance that they believed the individual required.
Thank you. To what extent, if at all, at this moment, in time, in this scenario, would a reasonable officer consider withdrawing or pulling back?
I think once you've made the decision to engage and to communicate with the individual, it's very difficult, and it would appear a little bit strange for an officer to just walk away from that situation. You've got to try and then maintain that communication, build that rapport with the individual, with a view to trying to persuade them, for want of a better terminology, to actually comply with what you're trying to do, and that you're trying to assist and trying to help them. So it would be very difficult, and I think unwise to some degree, based on the assessment of risk to the public at that point, to then just pull away and withdraw and leave that individual in the street.
Okay. At this moment in time, to what extent would a reasonable officer be feeding back information to ACR and their colleagues on the radio?
I would hope that once that initial assessment had been made, that would be done. It may well be that, as I say, if one officer is engaging, one officer is acting as the contact officer, that the cover officer may find it an opportunity to then transmit what is happening, because of, as I said before, the contact officer is now engaged solely with the individual, and it's very difficult for them to break off or think about other things other than, observing and trying to assess the individual and the situation that they're faced with.
But their colleague could?
Their colleague could, or again, if further officers arrive and they're not involved in that initial contact and they're standing back, it could well be a case of that's the opportunity for them to then give an update to the control room, or an update to the sergeant or other unit attending of what's happening and what they're seeing when they arrive.
Thank you. And at that moment in time, prior to the engagement you've been talking about, if an officer, a reasonable officer, is endeavouring to comply with the preclusion principle that you explained, where would they start?
They're looking at the different options. As I said, thinking of the element of the edge weapon, the knife, all of their tactical options that they should be considering should be trying to encourage them to deal with the individual at a distance, i.e. not close them down, not get within their sort of arm's reach.
We've heard the phrase reaction gap.
Reactionary gap, yeah. I mean, an initial reactionary gap when just dealing with an individual, not an armed individual, is 6 to 8 feet, an arm and a half's length. It's to give you the time to react to them moving or them doing something towards you. When we start adding edge weapons, that gap has to greatly increase. And we're looking at, 3, possibly 3 times, 4 times that distance, which may sound a bit strange, but if I consider an individual may be in possession of a weapon, I maybe want to be 20 plus feet away from them, across the other side of the street, trying to talk to them at a distance, sort of waving at them, shouting at them, or, as I said, with some sort of barrier between me. If that distance is reduced, some sort of barrier between myself and that individual, whether that be the car door, the van door, a bollard, a bush shelter, something that's, if the distance can't be maintained, then I want the barrier.
So if an officer, a reasonable officer, is trying to comply with the principle of preclusion, where would they start at that moment in time?
I would be starting with presence is there. I'll be starting with communication.
And as you've told us, there's quite a range in terms of tactical communications. What would a reasonable officer start with in terms of communication?
As I say, I think an initial response to the individual, trying to engage them, trying to get them to acknowledge that you're there, trying to get them to communicate verbally, possibly issuing some basic commands, just stay there, can I see your hands, don't come any closer, giving them those verbal cues. That may well then be also added to with a non-verbal cue of putting your hands up and giving them the international stop sign, just sort of stay where you are, you know, show me your hands, things like that. And then if I'm then thinking of other tactical options, as I said, I'm always thinking about how can I deal with this individual at a distance. So I personally, my tactical option in these situations would have been very similar to what the officers did, which would be drawing my irritant spray, because it's specifically designed to be discharged and deal with an individual at a distance rather than in close proximity.
Well, let's move on to another scenario where, following on from what we've been talking about, if the officers embark on verbal commands and they are not complied with by the subject. So again, looking at things from the hypothetical reasonable officer scenario, can we go back to the profiled offender behaviour 4.6, which is up the page? So at this point, the subject has not complied with the instructions from the officers. And if we can just come down a little bit, that's lovely. Can you tell us what behaviour of that, that's fine, thank you. In terms of looking at that profiled offender behaviour, what would a reasonable assessment of that behaviour be?
At that reasonable assessment, as I said, you've got some level 2, but you are into level 3 because you're getting non-compliance. The person is not doing what you're commanding them or instructing them to do. You know, and that could be as simple as stand still, they continue to walk towards me. Stop, they continue to walk towards me. So you are at that passive resistance, as we call it, because they're not complying with directions at that time.
And we've heard again that between the levels, there's not a clear dividing line, and that things can move from one to the other.
That's correct, yes.
Great. And what difference does it make if the person is already walking towards the officers when they get out of the van?
You then have to think of why is the person not complying with an instruction to stop and stand still. Obviously there's many reasons why that might be the case. It may be the case that they just don't like police and they don't want to do what they're being told by a police officer. Could be that they don't hear you, may have a hearing impairment, or it may be that there's some other reason whereby their rational response to a direction may not be being processed. So again, we would start thinking about the alcohol and drug intoxication, or the possible, you know, is it a language issue? Is it a possible mental health issue whereby this person just doesn't have the capacity to respond in the way that we would expect them to do?
And in light of that, can we move down again to 4.7? In terms of the reasonable officer response to that scenario, are you able to assist us with what a reasonable officer, how they might respond?
Well, as I said, going back to the training and how officers are taught to assess these, if we just go down a little bit further, please. We've tried officer presence, a tactical communication of sorts has been attempted, then we're being met with level 3, so we're now looking at the possibility of using level 3 control skills, or possibly, if justified, a level 4 defensive tactics.
Can we look at these levels for a moment? Level 3 control skills. This is the lowest level of physical use of force where some form of restraint applied to an offender, could be placing a hand on a person, up to handcuffs or leg restraints. In this situation where there is a question about whether the person has a knife in their possession, you can't see the knife, but you've not excluded that as a possibility. To what extent would a reasonable officer use level 3 skills?
So go back to, as I said before, I would preclude that as a tactical option, or any of those as a tactical option, because it needs me to be in close proximity to the individual. I would immediately be looking at defensive tactics in that situation, because there's a risk of the knife, of the edged weapon, and I'm looking at things that I can use to maintain that distance from that individual. So yes, I'd be moving away, I'd probably be backing away or considering getting back into the vehicle, but I would also be considering my irritant spray, using my CS or my Parva spray, possibly drawing a baton and using the baton as a distancing tool rather than a striking tool to keep that individual at bay. Or, as I said, looking at some other form of defensive posture or defensive positioning.
Do we see in the level 4 description at the end, but these tactics are generally perceived to be strikes, whether delivered by means of empty hand techniques or baton strikes, but also include the more robust defensive handcuffing techniques and the use of CS incapacitant spray?
Yes, when they're talking about robust defensive handcuffing, they're talking about applying the handcuffing and using the handcuff to regain control and take the person to the floor. Again, I would rule that out as a tactical option in this situation because it requires me to get within touching distance of the individual. Out of all of those, I'd be looking at either my incapacitant or my baton. And although they're all lumped in together there, what we also talk about is the injury potential of any use of force that we use or any piece of equipment that we use. A baton strike has far more injury potential than an incapacitant. Therefore, if I'm looking at the least intrusive option or the least minimum amount of force, the sensible selection for me and the minimum amount of force selection for me would be an incapacitant spray.
And then also it goes on to say, in circumstances where use of specialised operations are authorised, use of public order tactics, police dogs and specialist weapons available to authorised firearms officers, such as a launcher or a taser, may be considered as defensive tactics.
Yes.
And again, does it appear that within level 4 there is this range of options where one could escalate from empty hand techniques right up to launchers and tasers?
Again, sorry to sort of thing, I don't like that terminology, escalating up to, because a taser is a far less injurious option, again, to a baton. They're all defensive tactics. The injury potential of some of those, like the L104A1, it's basically it's a baton gun. It's a baton round, so you're getting hit with a hard bit of plastic with a rubber end on it at great velocity. Bruising, etc., but a less lethal option. It's classed as a less lethal option. Taser is a less lethal option. A baton strike, broken bone, possibly, serious contusion, etc., etc. So there's different injury potentials to each of those. But yes, they're all defensive tactics open to police to deal with that level of resistance.
So it wouldn't be fair for me to categorise that as an escalation because they are all different tactics within that defensive
They're all different tactics. They all have their different merits, but they also have a different level of injury potential. Therefore, when assessing minimum use of force, that question goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Why did I choose a baton and not an irritant spray? Why did I use a taser, a baton gun, etc., rather than? So that question has to be asked. Although they're all lumped together, and I said this is where the difficulty comes, they're all an option. However, you would still have to then look at why that particular option was chosen in that particular set of circumstances.
And depending on the circumstances, it may be that you simply don't have a taser available.
Yeah.
Or you do not have a police dog available or an ARV available.
Yes.
But you may have other options available to you.
Yes, I say, and at this point in the situation, a standard patrolling officer would have access to an irritant spray, handcuffs and batons, and then obviously their array of unarmed defensive tactics.
Or it may be that an officer does not have a baton but has a spray.
Yes.
And that would also be a factor which they would consider when determining what to preclude?
Well, certainly going to preclusion, one officer didn't have their baton in their possession at the time, so therefore it's an instant preclusion. It's a tactical option that's not available to them. They would have to explain why it wasn't available when they should be carrying it.
Thank you. And again, even at this stage, where we're talking about the profiled offender behaviour moving to 2, maybe 3, again, is this relevant information for a reasonable officer to factor into the national decision-making model and the risk assessment?
Yes, because they're looking at the level of resistance or the level of threat. Going back to the NDM, we categorise, or we talk about categorising risk into 3 sections: the person, objects involved in the situation, and the location, the place. So POP. So the person, you're looking at their demeanour, their build, their makeup. In relation to objects, we're looking at the possession of the believed possession of the knife, and then the place, we're looking at an open area, which, as I said on Friday, is quite a difficult position to deal with individuals and try and contain them. So all of those 3 elements, and then what that person is doing, the non-compliance, the resistance levels, is all pushing into the NDM and being assessed as we go forward through the incident.
And as well as that process being carried out, could you help us, what would a reasonable officer be doing in terms of providing feedback to ACR and other officers? As I said, I would hope that some or other, one of the other officers would be transmitting information where possible. But as I said, certainly the first officer engaged is unlikely to be doing anything until such time as they have what you might class as a natural gap in the situation. This situation developed ever so quickly, and the focus on feeding back to others would be negated. It would be sort of pushed to one side because the officers are fully engaged in the situation and in the dealing with the level of threat that they're perceiving within that incident. Thank you. Well, moving on now, I'd like to ask you some questions about a reasonable response if sprays are used, CS or PAVA, and the subject simply fails to react to the use of that spray and then walks away from officers.
Yes, both of the 2 irritant sprays have slightly different effects and also have slightly different reasons as to why they may be ineffective. On average, we talk to officers or we train officers in the fact that approximately 1 in 10 of the population, which rises when we start looking at intoxication and mental ill health. But on average, a normal individual, approximately 1 in 10 of the population are not affected by either CS or PAVA. They work differently. PAVA needs to be targeted at the face to be fully effective. So again, if you don't get them in the face with the PAVA, it's less effective. CS, however, affects the respiratory system, and if you get it in the proximity of the upper body and the chest, you tend to get a result from that irritant spray. So there's lots of reasons why either or wouldn't work or might not work, but they're both. A lot of that depends upon target acquisition, being able to hit the target that you're aiming at. It doesn't matter about how much you get on them. It's basically as long as you get something on them that it will work. But you take into consideration if you get no effect whatsoever from either or, and considering they were both discharged in this situation, you would start to look at the reasons why that individual wasn't affected. So if you're happy that you've hit the target and you've got the irritant onto the individual, you start thinking then is this person 1 of 10 that isn't responsive, or is it something else like intoxication, drug intoxication, or some sort of mental health episode that's preventing this individual from showing any signs of irritant or effect from those sprays.
Can I just go through some of that again? You've talked about different factors and the percentage of the population who are not affected. Is weather also an important factor?
Again, that would be whether I hit the target. If it's a really windy, nasty, horrible day and I spray and it ends up halfway down the street, it's quite common for officers to miss targets. Therefore, that part of the assessment is, did I get the target I was after? If not, do I reapply? Do I try again, possibly a bit closer or from a different direction? So that has to be factored in. But if I'm happy that I've hit the target and I've got the substance onto the individual, then the assessment moves to why is the person not responding to it.
And we've heard some evidence that with PAVA you're aiming for the eyes or
Yes.
the face area, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And with CS it can be more in the vicinity.
Yeah,
rather
you're still
than
hopefully aiming for the eye, but with CS you can still get a desired effect by hitting the upper torso and the body because of the design of what it is. As soon as it hits the body, it starts to biodegrade and basically it's breathed in by the individual.
So that would include if an officer had struck the shoulder area or the upper chest area?
Yes,
on the
certainly with
subject.
CS, yes.
Yeah. And then you've mentioned that a reasonable officer would be thinking about the reasons why that subject is not affected if they've sprayed them. And you mentioned intoxication or mental health.
Yes, correct.
So at this stage, if the reasonable officer is asking themselves what is the reason why these sprays haven't had an impact, what sort of things would a reasonable officer be considering?
Well, if you're looking at the fact of have I hit the target, yes or no, if you think no, you have an inkling that the weather may have taken it away, then I'd be looking at reapplication, so I'd be looking at respraying. If I'm happy that I've hit the target, then I would certainly then be looking at the reason why, and I would be starting to go down the line of this person is either intoxicated, because alcohol can reduce pain barriers, etc. Drugs, exactly the same, or mental ill health episode. Certain antipsychotic medications can affect pain receptors, can change how people respond to that sort of irritation.
And if a reasonable officer has been considering these factors and takes the view that perhaps the subject is intoxicated, drink or drugs, or is having a mental health crisis, what would the response be by that reasonable officer?
After spraying, so after discharge of the spray, and you've made that thing, that would then preclude that as a tactical option again, so you wouldn't reuse it, and you would be looking at then changing to some other form of control or some other form of defensive skill.
Right, well, before we move on to other defensive controls, in terms of identifying perhaps a medical emergency, either because the person's intoxicated or they're having a mental health crisis, what would the response by a reasonable officer be?
Well, you're now adding that ineffective irritant spray to the mix in relation to ABD. I would now be looking at, do I have sufficient, is everything okay with this individual? With what I've seen and what I've heard and what I'm witnessing, is this person acting rationally, reasonably? Are they responding to commands, or have they responded to the irritant? And I think with that now, where we are now, I would now be starting thinking that this person is suffering some form of disorder. We're not sure what, but I would certainly be now thinking that at this point everything's not well, and we need to try and deal with this individual.
And you said before that a reasonable officer dealing with that would be trying to obtain medical assistance.
I think that would certainly it should be in the factor of the thought process, whether it's feasible for the officer to actually sort of request that at that time because they're still actively engaged with the individual. But I think it should factor into their thought processes that at whatever time we manage to either keep this person contained or control this individual in some way, we're going to be looking at medical assistance for them. It might not be available at that particular time, or I might not be in a practicable position to do it, but at some point when it is practicable, I'm going to summon medical assistance.
If a reasonable officer was able to access their radio and to transmit over the radio, or if that reasonable officer was able to hit their emergency button, is that the sort of moment at which that information or that assistance, medical assistance, could be obtained?
It could be obtained or it could be requested. However, as I said, taking your attention away from the individual to make that rational, that physical action of opening the radio and then formulating what your request is, I don't think at that position the officers were in a practical position to do it. And when we talk about the emergency button is there predominantly to summon assistance that the officers require to deal with the situation. At that point, I wouldn't suggest that the medical assistance would have been a priority for them when they hit the emergency button. The priority would have been, can we have more units here? Can we have more help? They may have had time to add the medical assistance, but at that point, they're still trying to control and contain the subject.
And presumably the same would be the situation in relation to giving feedback to the ACR or other officers?
Yes, as I say, I think certainly the two initial officers were not probably in a position at that time to provide feedback. Whether the supporting officers were in a position, possibly. But as I said, I would have hoped that somebody arriving on scene would have given an update at some point.
So it wouldn't necessarily require to be the first officers at the scene who could provide that feedback?
It may not have been, depending on how engaged they were with the subject. Yeah.
So any other officers, reasonable officers arriving at the scene, could equally observe what was happening and feedback?
Yes.
To ACR?
Yes.
Thank you. And then moving on, if the subject, so having been sprayed, that having had no effect, and having continued to walk away from the officers, is further engaged by other officers, but then chases and strikes a female officer to the back of the head, and as she withdraws, that strike causes her to fall to the ground, forward onto the ground. So again, thinking, if we can go back to the profiled offender behaviour, please, which was 4.6, I'd like to, and we may need to go further down here, I'd like to know, in your view, what category would a reasonable officer put that type, sorry if you can carry on, put that type of, or how would a reasonable officer characterise that type of behaviour? So a strike to the rear of the head, causing the officer to fall onto the ground.
I think you've got to be looking at a minimum of a level 5. You're looking at assaultive behaviour, whereby an individual has been, or an officer has been struck. You could even, depending on the perception of the officers at the time, and certainly PC Tomlinson talks about his perception in relation to PC Short. You could be looking at a level 6, whereby serious injury or life-threatening injury, whereby she's been struck to the floor.
So again, very much dependent on the circumstances,
and also to the officer's perception of the level of force being applied by the subject, and the level of injury potential to the officer's concern.
Thank you. And then looking at the reasonable officer response, 4.7, I'd like you to help the chair by understanding the type of level of response that would be appropriate to that type of behaviour.
Further
Keep
down,
going, keep going.
Just
Thank
up a
you.
bit, sorry. Yeah, okay, yeah. Good. So, as we've already said, the defensive tactics that we've talked about, level 4, is already probably on the table. Officers are already considering and using elements of that with the incapacitating sprays. You've now, as I said, matching that level or going one above, based on the perception of the particular officer using the force. You could well be looking at a level 5, whereby you're using a tactical option that you know or believe could cause serious injury or could cause potential death.
Do we see at level 5, so the reasonable officer response, that this is a level of force that has the potential to cause serious injury or even death when it is applied?
That's correct, yes.
And it may, in certain circumstances where there is a serious risk of severe injury or life-threatening risk, be a deliberate choice of option, but in all circumstances must be proportionate to the perceived threat and degree of imminent danger.
Yes, and as I said, that would be the perceived level of threat by the officer applying that level of force, but they may well decide to use either a tactic or something outside of their training, or they may use a tactic or something within their training whereby they are aware that its application could cause serious injury or possibly death.
And so when it says perceived threat, the belief or the perception of the individual reasonable officer is an important factor.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, if they've believed an officer had been stabbed, for example, and then that officer was open to further attack by the subject, then again, lethal force at that point could be not just justifiable, but in their minds applicable to the situation.
And again, can you tell us at this stage what a reasonable officer would do in terms of feeding back to ACR or other officers?
Again, I think if you're at this point in a situation, feedback at this point is to that particular individual is pretty irrelevant. They're dealing specifically with the threat faced in front of them, or the threat faced by their colleague or the member of the public. So their sole focus will be on the processing of what's happening in front of them and dealing with that particular problem. What you tend to find with feedback, in radio transmissions, it comes at a natural break or a natural time within the situation whereby some degree of control has been achieved by the officers on scene. And at the position where we're talking about where PC Short has been knocked to the ground, the officers do not have any control or very little control over that situation at that time.
I want to ask you about, in this scenario that we're talking about, what, if anything, is a reasonable officer doing in terms of the NDM and the risk assessment at this stage?
They're using the NDM, as I said on Friday, but it's a more reactive process. You're still running the process in your mind and your cognitive processes, but you're not, how should we say, considering every single element of that decision-making process. You're very much reacting and responding to the visible cues that are happening in front of you, and you've got very little time to process that information. So yes, you are processing, you are conducting an assessment of the level of risk, how that level of risk is increased or decreased, and what options are open to you, but to rationally then be able to explain that, it's quite difficult in those circumstances. again, I spoke about the post-incident management. This is where this is very important, to allow officers to fully process their thought processes at a later stage, when they are in a much better position to rationally go over their thought processes, rather than in the heat of the moment or very shortly after an incident, when the effects of stress and the effects of the incident and the outcome of the incident are still fresh in their mind.
Thank you. And what, if anything, is a reasonable officer thinking about medical emergencies and mental health crises and intoxication at this point?
I would suggest it's in there, but it's not. It's nowhere near at the forefront of their thought processes. They're purely dealing with the threat they perceive in front of them, and until such time as that threat is diminished or has been negated, they're not really going to concentrate or consider anything else that they may have considered previously. As I said, until such time as that level of control or that level of sort of passiveness that comes across the situation.
Now, before I leave this scenario, can I just ask you about another situation of perception? You've touched on it a moment ago, where officers have arrived at the scene, other officers follow on very shortly afterwards, and one of those officers perceives the scene, or believes at that point that a colleague has been slashed.
Yes.
And so at that moment, where one officer has a belief that their officer has been injured, I'd like to ask you particularly what a reasonable officer would do with that belief, what actions they would take.
Well, based on the original information, if an officer then arrives and honestly believes that another officer has been injured with a weapon, with a knife, that to some degree should cement, even if they haven't seen the weapon, cement to that officer that the weapon is present within the incident. So the person is in possession of the knife, whether they see it or not. The risk, they've already carried out serious assaultive behaviour on another officer, who, to some degree could be life-threatening injuries. So you are including all of this in the mix of the level of threat, and you are considering what you may have to do to prevent any further injuries to that individual, or possibly to yourself or your colleague who you've arrived with. So at that point, a reasonable officer may well be considering basically any option that's open to them to deal with that particular situation, and that would include possibly causing serious injury or possibly fatal injury to that individual to prevent that attack from continuing.
What, if anything, would that officer be doing about feeding back or sharing that information with ACR or other colleagues?
Again, I think at that point, being realistic, they're so focused on the risk and the threat in front of them. Once they're in there, then it's very difficult for them to consider anything else other than the particular situation that's in front of them. As I said, the effects. One of the big effects of stress is this about this narrowing of focus, this fixation on one particular incident or situation. So as the officer's heart rate increases, their level of threat perception increases, their ability to think about external or other factors is quite difficult and virtually sometimes impossible to, other than dealing with the particular threat that they faced at that particular time.
So what would you expect a reasonable officer to, in that situation, to do in relation to seeking medical help for their colleague?
As I said, I think that it would be an option at that time, depending on the decision making process, but officers would probably realistically do one of three things. They would either run straight in and try to assist their colleague by either dealing with the individual or trying to administer help and assistance to their colleague, or they may well freeze to some degree and sort of be fixated in the situation, trying to come up with a solution to the problem that they're faced, because it's quite a dilemma, shall we say, of what you're faced with. So one of those three things I would have expected a reasonable officer to do. I wouldn't imagine that medical assistance would be immediate until such time as they assessed what the problem was with the officer.
What about even shouting to the colleague who they think is injured? Would you expect anyone to do that?
I might expect some verbal communication, but as I said, it's not unusual for officers to forget or not to communicate and just go into physical mode, go into physical actions rather than looking at cognitive communication. It's unusual, but it does happen.
Thank you. So, to go back to the situation we were talking about a moment ago, where the subject has chased and struck an officer to the back of the head, that officer has fallen to the ground, and then has stamped or had more than one stamp on that officer who is on the ground. Again, how would you describe that level of subject behaviour given the categories we've looked at?
If that was the case, and there were stamps, or the subject was now stamping on a unprotected officer on the floor, it shows a level of ongoing serious assaultive behaviour. Not only are we just looking at one attack here, we're looking at a sustained ongoing attack. The risk to an unprotected officer on the floor being stamped or kicked is very serious, internal injuries, etc., head injuries. So we're looking at possibly life-threatening injuries in that situation. So if that was the case and an officer was being stamped on the floor, then I would expect a reasonable officer to do anything within their capabilities to prevent that from happening, or to stop it from reoccurring. So, again, virtually I think it would be a case of just anything that they could do would be feasible and reasonable for them to stop that attack from occurring.
So their reasonable response would be up to level 5?
Yes, could well be.
And can I be clear, do you see much distinction or any distinction between a subject striking an officer to the back of the head so that she falls to the ground and stamping on that officer?
When we talk about injury potential, certainly within training, we talk quite a lot about what we call secondary injuries. So it's not the fact that the officer's been struck to the head, obviously that could cause serious issues, but in them then being knocked to the floor, the secondary risk of injuries, to head injuries, facial injuries, etc., greatly increases just the fact that they have been punched. So you have to look at the injury potential across the board. Again, once they're on the floor, if they are being then kicked and stamped, again, depending on the areas of the body that are being struck, there's potential for ruptured spleens, kidneys, etc., if they're being kicked in the back and the sides. The head's exposed, and we're looking at compounding injuries from that attack.
And knowing that, or considering those secondary or compound injuries or risk of injury to that officer, there really is only the level 5 response there.
At that point, if that's the perception and the honest held belief of the officer who's about to apply that force, then I would suggest that is about all they've got available to them. I mean, it may well be, from a level 4, it may be I decide to use a baton strike. However, the target area of that baton strike, as described by PC Tomlinson, may be known to me to have a serious risk of injury or possibly fatality. But that decision is still there. I'm using a baton strike from level 4, but I'm using it on a target area, or I may hit a target area. I may not even be deliberate, but I may hit a target area that I know may cause serious injury or possibly death.
So bearing in mind the possibility of preclusion and minimum force, in response to that scenario, that subject behaviour, what would a reasonable officer consider would be an appropriate response?
I think you take out the incapacitants because they've been used, tried and failed. Communication skills, tried, failed. You're really looking at either one-on-one, hand-to-hand restraint, or basically wrestling and fighting, or taking out your baton and using your baton to try and dysfunction and take the person's ability to attack the officer away from them.
Let's look at those two alternatives. Removing the subject from the officer, would that be a possibility?
If you could, yeah, it could be basically putting yourself in a position of danger to basically now go one-on-one with that individual to protect the officer on the floor. That could be going in and starting to basically trying to fight with that individual one-on-one, trying to restrain them, trying to wrestle them off the person, pull them away. Or it could be drawing your baton and using your baton because you think you've got an opportunity to prevent and stop the attack with that than you have by one-on-one physical altercation.
And how could the baton be used by a reasonable officer?
Strikes to the various parts of the body. I would suggest that where incapacitant has been ineffective, that would indicate to me personally that the pain threshold or the pain receptors of the individual are pretty much switched off. Therefore, dependent upon what we call pain compliance techniques or strikes to motor nerve points on the body, the upper arms, the legs, etc., are most likely to be ineffective. Therefore, my target areas are being reduced. My ability to deal with that individual may be nothing other than trying to knock that person over or give them such a blow that it would prevent them from continuing that attack. So I think what we could talk about within training of dysfunction and distraction techniques, they would be unlikely to work on an individual who has shown a total lack of response to irritant spray. Not impossible, but certainly very improbable that they would work.
But a reasonable officer might consider precluding them as something to attempt because they might not work.
They may do, yes, and again it would be for them to explain that preclusion. But certainly from my opinion as a reasonable officer, I would be precluding them because I would have seen that they're unlikely to work because of the response to the irritant spray.
So if I can just go back over one or two things before I move on. What about a strike to the back of the knees, so the back of the legs?
Again, it depends on some form of dysfunction. All that would tend to do might unlock the knee joint. It may cause the person to fall to their knees. It would not deal with the situation of the person stamping or attacking the other officer. Again, as I said, it depends on striking more, a small target, shall we say, and it's quite difficult to apply that sort of tactical choice in that sort of heightened, stressful situation.
And would the reasonable officer response include a baton strike to the head?
It could, in these circumstances, as I said. with the perception of the officer, honest held belief of imminent death or imminent, serious injury to their colleague, then it could justify or make that decision, that tactical decision, to strike to the head.
And what if the initial strike to the head caused the subject to stop stamping, but then further strikes to the head were applied?
Each strike should be assessed for its effectiveness and whether or not it has achieved the goal that it was set out to do. So if the first strike did stop the attack and possibly distance the individual from the officer to prevent them from re-attacking, then further strikes at that time, would be to the head would be, I think, would be difficult to justify.
But again, it would depend on the particular circumstances.
It would, but the other thing to remember as well is that although I've said that each individual strike should be assessed, it's very common in these sorts of circumstances for officers to deliver multiple strikes because they've locked in on their course of action. And I've dealt with numerous cases where officers have, been asked how many times they hit a subject, and they might say, 2 or 3 times, and the footage shows multiple strikes, but they've got no recollection of how many times they've struck them, or the fact that after 2 or 3 strikes, they may have achieved their goal, but at that point they hadn't taken in that recognition that the strike had caused what they wanted it to do.
Right. So that would be a suitable time.
We'll take a break for 20 minutes. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now, Mr. Graves, and talk about the situation where, as you put it, a reasonable officer may choose to use baton or to wrestle a subject to the ground, or perhaps shoulder charge a subject to the ground. But in that situation, the subject continues to struggle. So the officers have brought the subject to the ground, but he continues to struggle, perhaps forcefully, I should say. And I'd like to explore what the tactical options would be in that scenario for reasonable police officers.
Yes.
So how would a reasonable officer or officers respond to that situation where the subject continues to struggle, even though at this stage he's on the ground?
The restraint of an individual, or the attempted control of an individual on the ground, is very difficult. Certainly for one or even two officers. The sort of tactic or the solution that within the police that we look at within training is to use multiple officers to try and gain that level of control, so that they can be placed in handcuffs or other forms of mechanical restraint. Various techniques are taught to control the arms and the head, but initially the control phase, that we may call it, can be quite messy and quite sort of frantic as officers struggle to try and take hold of various limbs or try to prevent the individual from regaining their feet, trying to use the ground as a stable platform to work against.
And you're calling that the control phase?
Yes, it's people quite often call it restraint. The terminology I like to try and use is restraint is not achieved until full control of the individual has been achieved. So restraint is when they are unable to move out of the position or have been placed into handcuffs or limb restraints, etc. Up until that point, there is a phase of control where we're trying to gain control of both the individual and their limbs, their head, their legs, etc., so that they can be placed in that position of restraint.
So during this control phase, the officers are attempting to gain control, and there's both the process of them restraining the individual plus the individual struggling against that restraint.
Yes, so there's the attempt to restrain, and then there's the resistance, the level of resistance against the officers achieving their goal in that particular situation.
Thank you. You've talked about multiple officers. Are there guidelines or recommendations about the number of officers should be?
We look at using officers to overpower an individual. It may look quite over the top, but it's actually the safest methodology to control or to attempt to control an individual on the floor. So to safely restrain an individual, we would be looking at a minimum of 3 officers, preferably 4, and possibly even 5 or 6.
Right. Minimum of 3, possibly up to 5 or
Yes.
6. And you also talked about the location of those officers. You talked about arms and head. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, the resistance from individuals comes from their ability to be able to utilize their major muscle groups, so the muscles in their legs, their muscles in their upper body. The head is a fulcrum, like the hips, is something that if you control the head, it's quite difficult for an individual to move their body without moving their head. So we look at controlling both arms, at least one officer controlling the legs and an officer controlling the head.
When you say controlling the head, what is a reasonable officer doing to control the head?
Initially, without putting a finer point on it, they're grabbing the limb and trying to prevent the limb from moving around. That could be used by using their body weight against that limb, lying across it or sitting across it, holding onto it with their hands, possibly wrapping their arms around it.
So they'll a reasonable officer will seek to control the limbs. And in relation to the head, what will a reasonable officer do?
Again, the control would either be by holding the head in a position whereby it's secured against the ground. This prevents the individual from banging their head on the floor and sustaining secondary injuries. Or cradling the head similar to a rugby ball by basically placing your hands around it, depending on the position of the individual on the floor.
So if we're considering a scenario where there are 3 officers involved in a restraint, in relation to the lower limbs, the legs, what would a reasonable officer be expected to
Initially,
do?
they would attempt to control the legs by lying across them and then getting themselves in a position as close to the ankles as possible, which makes it more difficult for the individual to engage their major muscles. So you slide down the legs and hopefully wrap your arms around the ankles to prevent them from being able to lift their legs or pull their legs up towards them.
And to what extent would a reasonable officer use their own body weight for that process?
That would be the primary control feature in that point. Yes, you'd basically lie straight across the legs and then move yourself down towards the ankles by using your upper body weight to prevent them from lifting you up.
What about the arms? What would a reasonable officer do to gain control of the arms?
As I said, they could be pinned by holding onto the arms and pushing down by using your upper body weight. They may be actually laying across and wrapped up with the officer's arms, whereby you lie at the side of them and you cradle the arm and wrap the arm into a position where they can't move it.
When you say the word lay, if a reasonable officer would lay on the subject, can you describe to us?
They'd actually be on the ground with them, preferably not, but it can happen where you're actually lying on the ground next to them, or possibly even to some degree over the top of them.
As they're lying over the top of them, what weight would you expect a reasonable officer to be using?
At some point during the restraint, it's very common and very likely for the officers to have their body weight actually on the person. During training, we talk about minimising the time that this occurs to the best of their ability. But as I said, this frantic phase of initial control is quite difficult, and it is very common for officers to actually apply force with body weight at that initial control phase.
For a reasonable officer who's bearing in mind the principles of preclusion and minimum force and such like, what would they do to guard against putting their body weight on the subject?
As I said, we show them different techniques of being able to try and control the limbs. Unfortunately, sometimes if somebody is particularly strong or the level of resistance that they're offering is negating the officer being able to gain control of that limb, their only option may be to use their body weight as the control measure in that initial circumstances to actually get hold of and control that particular limb.
Are there any restrictions given in relation to the amount of time an officer is a reasonable officer is able to use their body weight in that way?
There's no specific time frame within the training, but officers are advised and guided to keep any time whereby weight is applied to the individual to the minimum possible.
What are reasonable officers advised about the risks associated with that?
We start to look at the breathing mechanism, and we start to discuss the situation around positional asphyxia or restraint asphyxia. This is a well-known terminology within police training and has been since sort of the late 90s. We look at the requirement of the individual for oxygen and how a violent struggle can increase that requirement for oxygen, and thereby any restriction placed upon that individual, how that impacts on their ability to take that level of oxygen in. So it really looks at the balance of the requirement v the requirement to restrain the individual, and in closing on that one, what we actually look at is that there may come a time during a restraint whereby if officers cannot gain control of an individual, there has to be a consideration to disengage from the individual because it becomes unsafe to continue that attempt for that prolonged period of time.
Is there any guidance or otherwise information available to a reasonable officer about when that moment of disengagement would arrive?
Not in relation to sort of time frames. There's no sort of set time frame within the training. It's really a judgment call for the officers as to whether or not they believe they can control the individual. I have seen situations whereby very large, very strong individuals, even with 5 or 6 officers, it's been, difficult, if nigh on impossible, for the officers to restrain that person. And other tactical options then have had to be considered. So in those situations, it may be the case where the restraint has been attempted, has failed, and they'll disengage and then use irritant sprays. Or, nowadays that's when a taser may be deployed after a restraint has been attempted. So yes, there is that option to disengage.
So that option is there, and factors that may be relevant, would that include the number of officers that were involved in this restraint or arriving to be involved in the restraint?
Officer number is an important factor. So is the skill level of the officers, their ability to apply the techniques as they've been taught to them in training. So there's a lot of factors that can lengthen or shorten a control phase of a planned restraint. Yes.
Before I move on, because I have a number of questions in this regard, you did use the words next to them. When you were talking about, I was asking about lying on the subject, and you also talked about not just over the top to control the arms, but you said next to them. And I'm wondering if I can ask you to explain that.
Depending on the position of the individual, we talk about 2 positions when a person is on the floor, either prone, face down, or supine, which is face up. During a ground restraint, a person can end up in either of these 2 places, or even on their side. So there's various options. If we look at the prone position, which is normally the preferred position where we want to try and turn the subject to, because it makes it easier and safer for the officers to restrain in that position. You may think of the person having their arms out to their sides, and the officer basically being between the arm and the body, with their body weight over the top of the individual's shoulder blade, holding onto the arm in this sort of position here, with the arm here.
So that would be one arm being held onto by
one officer.
The officer. And that would be them lying next to them, in line with their body, not lying over their
Yes,
body.
basically sort of lying slightly sort of 45 degrees to the subject's body, in the gap between the outstretched arm and the side of the torso.
What would, if there are only 3 officers involved in the restraint, what about the other arm? What happens?
Officer on each arm, 1 officer on the legs.
The head?
As and when a 4th officer arrived, I would expect that 4th officer to go to that location, go to the head, control the head, and then also take control of the planned restraint from there, because they're in the best position to see what is going on and communicate with the subject, but also communicate with the officers involved.
So while there were, if there are 3 officers available for the restraint, you would envisage that 1 would be on either arm and 1 would be covering the legs? In
ideal circumstances, yes. That's the 3 major risk points of the individual being able to assault or resist the officers. So you want both arms controlled and you want the legs controlled.
And is that in accordance with this training that's given in relation to restraint?
Yeah.
And if a 4th officer arrives to assist, that officer would go to the head?
That would be, as per the training, yes, best practice would be to go to the head. It may be the case that the officer on one of the arms or the legs may be struggling, so they may go to support them, or they may actually be in a position at that stage whereby the fourth officer arrives that they're able to place the individual into handcuffs. So the fourth officer may well come in and apply handcuffs and assist in that process with the other three officers.
And if we're talking about, say, a fourth officer at the head, I think you talked about that person being in charge of planning the restraint. What do you
it's
mean
not so
by
much
that?
planning, it's then taking control of what's happening, because being at the head of the individual, you can look down the body, you can see how the other officers are reacting, how they're managing to control the individual limbs. So it may be the case of you then say to one of them, can you get a handcuff on? Are you okay with that, with the legs? Yes, no, and start to communicate between the officers to sort of get that individual into a position where you can handcuff them.
If there are only 3 officers involved in a restraint at that stage, who would be in control of that then?
It would be a matter for the officers to sort of sort out between themselves. Nobody's in direct position to clearly take control of that situation. Therefore, it would be a matter of them communicating between themselves, possibly one of them attempting, saying, I'm going for handcuffs. One of them saying, I've got the legs, I'm secure on the legs, and then it gives them, the other officers, information around where they're at within the phase of the restraint.
During that phase of the restraint, would you expect those officers to be sharing updates about who's got control of the legs or what's happening at their end?
Hopefully between themselves, yes. As I said, what you've got to remember, they're all concentrating on their own jobs, but you would hope that somebody would be shouting, I've got the legs, I've got the arm, etc., I've got a cuff on, things like that. That's the sort of communication I would be expecting.
And then they would all know what was happening?
Hopefully, yes.
And we've heard some mention of a safety officer. Have you heard of that?
Yes, that was brought in, certainly within England, some time ago, whereby this is this person at the head. It followed an inquiry in London, whereby recommendations around restraint of individuals came up with the process of somebody taking overall charge and responsibility for the restraint process. And it was decided, as we went through the training and looked at the tactics we were already deploying, that this person would be best situated at the head, as I said, for the purposes of being able to monitor the individual, communicate with them, monitor their breathing, see what sort of condition they're in, but being able to control and then direct the restraint from that position. It can sometimes be a completely independent individual who has no involvement in the actual restraint, specifically in sort of a custody environment and things like that. It sometimes would be the custody officer who is standing back, not actually being involved in the control of the individual, but is directing the officers as to what they want to happen, i.e. somebody get in there, get a handcuff on there, I want limb restraints on the legs, etc., and actually directing, but also asking for feedback from the head officer in relation to the condition of the individual on the floor.
Do you know if training or that setup existed in Scotland in 2015?
I'm not fully aware if they used the terminology safety officer, and I couldn't find anything within the training materials. However, it was pretty standard practice across the board by 2015.
Right, thank you. And do you remember the name of that inquiry that made those recommendations?
I think it was about 2008 or 2009. It was a long time ago, but I was involved in that inquiry investigation, yeah, but it was a long time ago.
All right. What difference, if any, does it make if the subject is prone?
The prone position in itself isn't an issue. A lot of people will say that prone restraint in itself is dangerous. It's not an opinion I hold, and I disagree with it. We can sleep on our fronts, we can lie on our fronts without any problem whatsoever. The issue becomes either whether it be a prone position or a supine position, is when pressure is applied to the individual which prevents one or more of the breathing mechanisms from operating. I'm not a medical expert, but as I said, I've spent many years researching this. In essence, in reality, we need three things to be able to breathe. We need an unobstructed airway. We need to be able to take oxygen in. Our chest needs to be able to expand, and our diaphragm needs to be able to rise and fall. If any one of those three activities are restricted, then that affects our ability to breathe, or affects the ability of the amount of oxygen we can take in. So looking at those elements, any restriction on an individual's body, i.e. locking their shoulders, placing weight across the abdomen, placing weight across the chest, placing weight across the back, can impede the breathing mechanisms of the individual. So these are all highlighted during training, and although it may occur, again, we go back to this analogy that we look at the minimum amount of time required to achieve the goal that the officers are trying to achieve, and understanding the risks to the subject if that type of pressure is applied at any time during the control or restraint phase.
And you mentioned earlier this morning that a CS spray can have an impact on a person's respiratory cycle.
Yeah, again, it inflames the respiratory tract, and by its nature causes coughing and a difficulty in breathing. So again, if a person has been sprayed with an irritant spray, whether it be parvo or CS, again, that's a risk factor towards understanding the reduction in oxygen intake for that individual.
And if a reasonable officer was aware that the subject had been sprayed with CS and or PAVA spray, is that a factor that they would bear in mind when they're considering those risks to the subject?
They certainly should be, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And what difference, if any, would it make to what you've said already if the subject is struggling very forcefully and seeks to even bench press officers from him?
Any physical exertion from the individual increases their requirement for oxygen. So as their heart rate goes up, their respiration rises, their requirement for oxygen is increased. So after or during a struggle, a person needs far more oxygen against when just lying peacefully on the floor, for example. So as they need more oxygen, it's not about the fact that they can't breathe, it's a fact that they can't breathe sufficiently to take enough oxygen in for what their requirements are, therefore asphyxiation.
And that's the positional asphyxiation you were talking about?
Yes, because the asphyxia is being caused by the position that the person is in, and they're unable to escape from that position. So it's not so much the position, it's the fact that they can't escape to increase their ability to take in oxygen.
Thank you. When we're considering a reasonable officer, what difference would it make to a reasonable officer if the subject remains non-verbal throughout the restraint? So you've talked about a safety officer communicating with the subject, but what difference would it make to a reasonable officer and their actions if the subject said nothing?
They possibly wouldn't be talking, and I've dealt with a number of cases like this, but you will be expecting to hear some form of noise coming from them. They will be probably shouting, groaning, moaning, etc. One of the other risk factors that we point out to officers is a person who's very verbal and very resistive going quiet, or somebody who's very quiet suddenly becoming resistive or increasing their level of resistance. Obviously, if a person is talking to you or shouting back, whether it be abusive, etc., it is an indication to breathing, but not particularly a sufficient level of breathing. It can sometimes, you will quite often hear officers saying, oh, they're breathing, they're okay. That's not the case. They're breathing, they're applying, but is the level of oxygen that they require, are they able to take that in sufficiently? That's where the problem is. And after a prolonged restraint or an active period, that person's requirement for oxygen is far greater.
Is that something that reasonable officers would know about?
Yes, it should form part of the training, yes.
And what difference, if any, would it make, and you may have already answered this, but what difference would it make if the subject was making roaring noises and maybe said something similar to "get off me"?
As I said, it would indicate a breathing response, because we can't talk unless we breathe in. So it would indicate to the officers that they were breathing. As I said, my caveat would be are they breathing sufficiently for their requirements? And that is, a judgment of the officers looking at the individual, their pallor, their level of resistance, whether they've become passive, etc., but taking all those risk factors into consideration.
Thank you. When we look at the restraint itself, what techniques may a reasonable officer use as part of the restraint?
If they're struggling to control the individual, they may well decide to try and utilise techniques such as pressure point control, whereby they're applying pressure or strikes to certain parts of the body to try and take the resistance out of the individual. Simple analogy would be, say, possibly if anybody's ever suffered a dead leg, so they may strike to the major muscle groups of the legs, they may strike to the major muscle groups of the arms to try and take the level of lock or resistance out of the arms, so that the arms can be moved into a position whereby they can be handcuffed.
Would those strikes include possible baton strikes?
They could do. They're using the baton in what we call a closed position, whereby you're using it as a sort of a jabbing tool, or it may be the fact that the baton's being extended and the baton is used again to strike those major groups, those nerve clusters around the body that we talk about, to actually encourage a dysfunction, a dead leg, a dead arm, so that the person can be moved.
So a reasonable officer could take account of that and adopt those techniques during
could,
restraint?
but I would suggest, with the other conversations we've had around this particular incident, you have to look at the ineffectiveness of some of those similar techniques already, and whether or not they would be a precluded suggestion. It doesn't mean I wouldn't use them, but I may be thinking, are they actually going to be effective? But I may still then attempt them to see if they will assist in the restraint of the individual.
Reasonable officers may take the view that they should try and see if they fail or succeed, or they may say, I've tried other things and those wouldn't be successful.
Yes, they could consider either trying them to see if they will work, or the fact I've considered them, I've precluded them because I don't think they will work.
So again, preclusion and the principle of that is something that reasonable officers would bear in mind.
Yes.
And then if an officer was using a technique perhaps with their baton on the arm of a subject, maybe that wasn't trained as part of the OST training, in terms of what a reasonable officer might do in those situations, is that something they'd avoid or something they would?
As I said, just the fact that a technique or something that an officer tries isn't trained, it shouldn't preclude it to whether or not it's reasonable in the circumstances and was necessary based on the perception of the officer. Sometimes some services show restraint by using the baton to actually pin a limb, pin an arm, pin a leg across a muscle group. But as I say, the idea of dysfunction distraction works on the application of pressure or strikes to a certain part of the body. How that pressure is applied, it could be different in the circumstances that the officer finds themselves.
Thank you. Moving on, I'd like to ask you about when the subject is on the ground, either prone or supine. The struggle, that control phase that you've been discussing, has continued for around 4 minutes. and during which the officers have managed to secure handcuffs and leg restraints. And the subject is then turned onto his side, and officers see that he's unconscious or appears to be unconscious. So I'm interested in your views on what tactical options would be open to reasonable officers at that moment in time.
So we're talking about the restraint process now taking that length of time. So the person at that point would be classed as restrained because they've been placed in handcuffs and they've also been placed in limb restraints. The side restraint position, going back to the amendments and the updates that we talked about, the safety officer, that was something that we were brought in again to increase the ability of the individual to breathe, and a position where we know they can be safely held while still allowing the diaphragm to rise and fall and the chest to expand. So that's sort of what we class as the conclusion of that restraint process when we've got to that sort of positioning.
Is that the conclusion of the control phase?
The control phase would have been is basically finishes once the handcuffs and the limb restraints go on, and then we've got them into a safe position that we can control. We can put them in that position. We can hold them in that position, and that will ease their breathing, and we can now monitor, and everybody can take a breath at that point.
Thank you.
So we get to that stage, and that's basically the end of what we would class as the restraint phase. One thing with this particular incident, Mr. Byer was handcuffed to the front. Even in handcuffs to the front, a person can still resist at that point with the handcuffs in that position. Best practice is handcuffed to the rear, but again, there's a number of times when you'll see restraints. The officers are unable to get the limbs into that position because of the level of resistance from the individual. So they will get on handcuffs however they can, and it will quite often be to the front. What you then look at is then the assessment of the individual. If you then get to that point and you believe or suspect that the individual is unresponsive, is the terminology that I would use, then you have to now consider that, does that person now need medical assistance? And if so, would that include the removal of the handcuffs to administer that medical assistance? The caveat to that is always bearing in mind that the safety element for the officers is still paramount here, because at some point, this person may be faking it. This person may just be,
feigning unconsciousness.
Feigning that unconsciousness or that unresponsiveness. So you have to make that judgment call in relation to whether it's safe to remove the handcuffs at that time. But if you decide it is a true medical emergency and that person now is unresponsive, then I would expect the reasonable officer to be removing the handcuffs and administering first aid at that point.
When you say administering first aid, what steps would a reasonable officer take or consider taking at that stage?
I would obviously, relaying to their first aid training, so that the doctor's ABC mnemonic. I'd be obviously checking for danger, checking for responses. So I would be basically trying to ensure whether or not this person is unresponsive. So I'd be talking at them. I'd be looking at a physical response, flicking the shoulder blades, possibly nipping the earlobes to see if I have any sort of response from them, from a physical stimulus. If they're not responding to voice commands, they're not responding to physical commands, then at that point I'd be looking at them being unresponsive or unconscious. I'd be summoning medical assistance, calling an ambulance, etc.
Thank you. You've talked about taking physical steps, flicking their shoulder blades or their earlobes. And what's the purpose of that?
It's dependent on the levels of consciousness of an individual. They may well be able to respond to a verbal cue. So if I say to you, you're lying there, I'll say, hello, you don't respond. If I say, open your eyes, you might not be able to respond to me verbally, but you might be able to open your eyes, which shows a level of consciousness. If you don't open your eyes, you may well respond if I cause a physical activity to you, whereby I nip your earlobes, or I flick your collarbones. You may move, you may open your eyes because of that physical interaction. So that gives me some degree or some idea as whether or not you are responsive to one of those three one of those three things. If you're not, then under first aid guidelines, then you are unresponsive. And that would be the terminology, officers would use. That person is unresponsive, unconscious, and that is a medical emergency.
Right. Would you consider slapping the subject's face or cheeks area?
Not within the first aid training. You'll quite often see paramedics and medical staff using what they call a sternum rub, where they'll use a knuckle on the sternum, things like that. That's not trained within police first aid. It is merely some form of physical act that will cause a reaction, a physical reaction from the person.
And if the person remains not responsive, then that's the moment where a reasonable officer would seek medical assistance.
That's correct, yes.
And again, seeking that medical assistance, would that be getting on the radio and calling for an ambulance?
Yes, I would expect that to happen, yes.
Thank you. If, so moving on finally to if the subject is on the ground, and we've described how they're on their side, they've noticed to be non-responsive, they've then moved on to their back, supine,
Yeah.
and they're still in handcuffs and leg restraints. And then officers notice that the person has stopped breathing. So this is a change from unconscious but breathing, but now the subject has stopped breathing. And this is more than 4 minutes later. And during that period, there has been airwaves transmission suggesting that the subject was struck to the head with a baton and sprayed with CS and Pava spray. So that's been on the airwaves transmission, the radio communications. So they're now on their back, they're unconscious or non-responsive, and they're noted to have stopped breathing more than 4 minutes later. So in that scenario, would you be able to share with us what a reasonable officer would be doing at that stage?
Having conducted the response review, as I said, under the doctor's ABC, you now shout for help or you call for help. The next step would be to check the airway, that the airway is open. So go back to what I said about the airway having to be unobstructed. So you check that the airway is unobstructed and open. You then check for breathing. If you check for breathing in that position and you find that the person is not breathing, then you immediately commence CPR and rescue breaths. So I would have expected an officer or officers on the scene to conduct that process and commence CPR if it was believed the person was not breathing. That update should then be sent to the ambulance service, because it changes the priority of the call, because you've now got not just an unresponsive person, you've got an unresponsive person not breathing, and it changes the priority of the call within the ambulance service. I would expect that update to go out to the area control room and certainly to the supervisor on scene, because we're now looking at a probable critical incident, major incident being declared, and certain protocols having to be put in place.
So at that point, there may be a critical incident
Yes.
declared. Is there a difference or a period of time where the person is breathing? There's a difference between breathing and not breathing, but what about the period in between, where you're breathing 1 minute and then not breathing the next? Is there a phase of
Well, you
breathing?
get various phases. You get individuals gasping for breath, anticostal breathing, which is the sort of short intakes of breath. So you get different phases. But if that's not witnessed by the officers, and at the stage where they're assessing the person has stopped breathing, then you're straight into that CPR and that rescue breath formulation from their first aid training.
If there is a period of around 4 minutes between the person noticed to be non-responsive but breathing, and then noticed to be not breathing, not responsive. So around 4 minutes.
I thought the 4 minutes was from the commencement of the control period to the end of the restraint period.
Yes, so let me be clear about this. There's a period of around 4 minutes during the control phase, up to the point where the subject is noticed to be turned onto his side
And unresponsive.
and noticed to be non-responsive. That's a period of around 4 minutes. And then from the period when he's noticed to be unresponsive until the period when he's noticed to be not breathing, that's a period of another 4 minutes.
I would say if the person is unresponsive, following your standard protocols, that's a long period of time before you assess for breathing. It shouldn't take more than 30 seconds to a minute to place the person on their back, open and check their airway, check for breathing for 10 seconds minimum, to make sure to see if they are breathing, and if they're not breathing, make that decision to commence CPR.
What would a reasonable officer be doing between the period where the subject is non-responsive but breathing and the later period? What monitoring would a reasonable officer be doing?
Well, the officer who's done the response check, I would expect them to be going straight into the CPR phase, checking the breathing, etc. Other officers could be considering the calling of the ambulance or updating of the ambulance, updating the ACR, etc. But at least an officer who's done that initial check for the responses should now be taking control or taking the lead for that first aid requirement.
So if the person is not responsive but breathing, would a reasonable officer simply step back from that subject and leave them lying on the ground?
I say somebody should be, whoever's done the check, I would expect them to be taking the lead or turning to another officer and saying, start CPR, get the handcuffs off, get them on their back, etc. Somebody has to take control at that position. And as I said, normally, if you're the individual administering first aid and have done the response check, you would normally therefore continue that process by checking the airway, checking for breathing, no breathing, commencing CPR. You would normally do that unless you dictated somebody else to start that on your behalf because you are going to get a bit of equipment or grab a first aid kit or a defibrillator or something like that.
So if the person is not responsive and breathing, lying on his back, would reasonable officers be content to simply step back from the subject and not carry out any further monitoring?
Unresponsive breathing, recovery position. So we go back to the side restraint position. So I would expect that if the assessment was that they were breathing, then they would be placed back on their side in a recovery position, which allows them to continue breathing in that position, and it allows you an ability to monitor them.
And what would that monitoring look like for a reasonable officer?
Monitoring the breathing, again, continue checking things like capillary refill if they've got blood supply, etc. Just doing a check to try and find out the reason, which may obviously be obvious, but you're looking for the reason as to why the person is unresponsive to you.
So you wouldn't leave this subject, a reasonable officer would continue to monitor?
Yes, you're now in a first aid situation, not a restraint situation, and you're duty bound to monitor that individual until such time as either medical assistance arrives and takes over or somebody else takes over from you.
Thank you. Can I ask, during that period of first aid assistance, if we can call it that, either when the subject is unresponsive or unresponsive and not breathing, what would reasonable officers do in relation to the handcuffs?
As the individual was handcuffed to the front, they may not be interfering with the ability of the officers to assess the person. I would suggest that if CPR was required and rescue breaths, they would impede that ability. So I would have expected the handcuffs to be removed at that stage.
Is that what a reasonable officer
Yes,
would do?
yes.
And what about leg restraints? What would a reasonable officer do in relation to those?
Again, if they weren't impeding, officers may decide to leave them on, but again, I would suggest that they would probably be coming off as well. We're now looking at somebody receiving CPR who's very likely to be going off to hospital, so you want them ready for transportation and ready for the ambulance service to take over that treatment.
When we think about first aid and what reasonable officers might do, in a situation where it's been wet that day, it's been raining, the weather's not pleasant, would a reasonable officer consider doing anything with covering the subject as he was on the ground, or getting a blanket? Or
Not at that stage. What you might consider, I mean, so the primary response is the delivery of the CPR. Putting a blanket over them would get in the way of that, would affect that. So you're basically now in life-saving mode rather than comfort mode or treatment mode. You're trying to save this individual's life by delivering CPR. What you might consider at some point is placing something underneath the individual to insulate them from the floor, but at that particular point, your primary concern is the life-saving delivery of CPR.
Thank you. Can I move on and ask you about the threat of terrorism, threat levels in the police service at that time in May 2015? Considering we've talked at length about factors and perception of officers, if we consider a reasonable officer was concerned about terrorism or the threat levels in existence at that time, at what point would you consider a reasonable officer to be bearing that risk in mind in relation to any incident they're called out to where someone is said to have a knife?
Again, at that particular time, the risk specifically to police officers within the UK was severe. There had been intelligence and circulations from the counter-terrorism command in relation to the possibility of officers being lured into situations whereby the primary objective was for a lone wolf or a lone terrorist or a terrorist cell to actually attack and kill a police officer on the UK mainland. So that was reiterated. It had actually appeared on various news media outlets, and it had been disseminated within the police service across the whole of the UK. So if that was in an officer's sort of thought processes, it would impact on their perception of dealing with certain types of calls, and to a degree of giving that hesitancy in relation to, is this a genuine call or is this not a genuine call? And again, looking at that intelligence based against the information, it may well impact on an officer's decision-making process, yes.
And so is that a factor that would be part of the NDM and the risk assessment process?
If that officer had that information as part of their thought process, yes, it would impact, and it would be formulated as part of the NDM, yes.
Thank you. And then we've talked about perception of officers and that being an important issue. Have you heard of racial threat theory?
Yes.
When we talk about the perception of threat in a reasonable officer's mind, to what extent would the threat of the person's race and the perception of that person's race be a factor?
It would be a factor if it had been part of the intelligence provided to that officer. If the intelligence says that an individual, a terrorist profile is of a certain racial background, that by its very nature must implement that. If I think I'm dealing with a terrorist incident, that must factor into my thought processes if I come across an individual who meets that profile. You know, it's human nature to apply that thought process.
So if the intelligence had linked a particular race with a particular terrorist threat, then that again is something that could have been incorporated into a risk assessment by a reasonable officer.
I think it's reasonable to consider that would be there. It must be obviously tailored with other information and other intelligence around that individual or that particular racial profiling. But I think it would and probably could form part of that decision-making process, yes.
If there is no link made within that intelligence between a particular race and a terrorist threat, or any threat for that matter, would a reasonable officer make that connection or include that link in their risk assessment?
I think they would. I think they would also use that type of information, not just in relation to terrorism, but in general policing. If the intelligence is of a certain ilk, it has to. You have to bear that in mind as part of that threat assessment. Yes.
And if there is no link made?
If there's no link made, then it wouldn't be a relevant factor.
Thank you. Could you just give me a moment, please? Thank you very much, Mr. Greaves. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we'll stop there and sit at 2 o'clock.